and welcome to Imagination Wednesday. This Wednesday, we're going to have polycrisis as our topic. It's chapter 3 from the Imagination Dilemma book, and we're going to look at the different elements of the polycrisis, tools that we can use to imagine through that, and then also look at innovative ways that people have thought about the polycrisis differently. So let's begin. There we go. I want to introduce myself first. If you are new to this, my name is Lydia. I'm a social scientist. I'm a national security professional. I think in terms of thinking, systems thinking, and I'm a technology strategist. Some of my professional history includes working with the DoD, Special Operations, NATO, the European Commission, the United Nations, MIT, and Oxford Business School. And in my professional capacity, I have been working to understand futures of tech, what they mean for the government side, the future of warfare, and many other realms. And so this is a series explaining the tools that I use and the ways that I see the world. So here we are in our webinar series roadmap, chapter 3. We're going to conclude with part 1 with this session and then move next week to part 2, which is the facets of imagination. And today in this session, I'm just going to run through what we're going to talk about and then start talking about it. So we're going to talk about the different crisis buckets. They are the crisis bucket itself of just crisis. Then there's the new norms of the crisis bucket and then the transitionary bucket. I'll explain each one and what they look like and what they mean, and also how to use any generative AI platform that you like to analyze it quicker. And then the tools that I think are most useful to analyzing risk and crisis are the PESTEL framework, and I'm going to go over 8 specific risks that need to be managed. But first, I've said polycrisis so many times, what does it mean? So basically, it's the simultaneous occurrence of several catastrophic events. And it could include environmental stability, geopolitical volatility, armed conflict, erosion of democracy, cost of living crisis, mass migration, supply chain uncertainty, and many more other kinds of things as well. But the key is that they're happening all at once. And if you remember in the last 2 webinars, I talked about how I make sense of the world by seeing it through the digital economy systems. And I shared this slide. Well, it's not just this happening alone, but here is where we can add the polycrisis on top of it. And this is just how I see things. And so when I look at a problem set, I have this map kind of in my mind, and I'm doing the crisscrosses of what aspects are intersecting with what different things. And the polycrisis here intersects throughout every aspect of the digital economy. This is a graphic you will find at the end of the book as well. I thought it was so valuable that I put it on the last page so you can easily reference it. So global trends buckets, crisis, new norms, and transitionary. For the new norms one, I had originally called it new normals, but my literary editor said that wasn't going to be okay. So it's called new norms. But in essence, it's a new normal, something that has changed, and now we have a new normal. Starting with a crisis, I mean, this is a legitimate crisis bucket. So, because there's many things in the polycrisis, but the legitimate real crisis we have is war. We've got deteriorating climate situation. We have also the erosion of natural resources and the cost of living, so inflation skyrocketing. These are genuine situations of crisis that really need to be managed. And one of the ways I like to also understand these crises is just not just from what it is they do directly, but also indirectly. In that sense, second order thinking is really valuable. So what is the one domino that hits the next domino that hits the next domino? And this is something that I'll get into depth in chapter 5. So webinar 5, which is about the convergence of technologies. So just kind of a little heads up. So let's deep dive into one of the crisis elements in the crisis bucket, which is climate change. I really like this framework by the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. They have this thing called the planetary boundaries framework. And I see it as our planet's KPIs and ways that we can really measure and see what's happening. And so climate scientists working with PESTEL have identified these different planetary boundaries, and they're able to measure them and track them and assess what is happening. If you're interested in learning more about this, I really recommend it because climate impacts every single industry and every single market, and us humans as well. So there's a film on Netflix that expands on this science, and it's quite easy to understand in that film. But I want to show you here how, since they've been tracking this, they have noticed that we have crossed planetary boundaries. And what that means is the moment that we get into the red, which you'll see we have a lot of here, all of a sudden we're going to start to experience adverse effects in our environment. All of these things have second order, third order, fourth order, and many other orders of effects. It is a string of dominoes. And this is one of the types of crisis that really needs to be understood and anticipated. And I think that this framework is a good one to leverage for that. Moving on to the new norms, also the new normals, as I would have preferred to call it. There are many. So chatting with algorithms is now a new norm. We start to see AI agents all around us. And humanoid robots are starting to become a thing that could be in our day-to-day lives by the end of this decade. And then we have the demographic change. Traditionally, it has been that there are more youth compared to the elderly population. And so you would have a triangle, so to speak, where the tip would be the older population, and then the bottom part, the wider part, would be the youth. But now that triangle has slowly kind of almost tipped over, and we're having few babies being born. And so the demographic composition is changing. And so this is a new normal. A society where there are more older people than younger people is something that is happening in industrialized countries, and something that we will need to adjust to. As this is happening, we're also starting to see lifespan increase. And so it's not just that we're having fewer babies being born and the population of older people is larger, but also that they are living longer and they are growing to be an older age than we are accustomed to. So we're starting to see more and more people get to their 80s and 90s. And this also requires some adjustment. This is something that I looked into and delivered a presentation to the Federal Foresight Community of Interest, talking about how longer lives need to be prepared for from an organizational standpoint. So here I've outlined some of the elements that need to be thought of inside an organization. So one thing is, I guess the most obvious, which is preparing for a labor shortage. So as people get older and are eligible for retirement, many choose to retire and they leave with their talent. And so organizations will need to find new ways to anticipate and plan for that labor shortage that is coming. Of course, artificial intelligence is one potential solution, but many other things should be considered as well. And then another thing that I advocated for is cultivating a longevity mindset. So awareness sessions about how our demographics are changing, so that the organization or leadership, people who need to make decisions, don't see this as kind of something new, are more accustomed to this, and don't get blindsided all of a sudden. And then advocating for a policy, creating a policy inside an organization to say, how can we create a policy that retains talent as they get older? It doesn't have to be full-time, could be part-time, but how does the organization continue to deliver its value when a significant majority of its older population leaves, and potentially there won't be the younger population to substitute it. And so finally, developing a strategy around that can help put organizations ahead of this evolving trend. Then we have the transitionary bucket, which is just basically something that's happening in its transition. Sometimes people can see that as a crisis or too much happening or volatility, but it's not a crisis, it's a transition. And I think that when you have a mindset of transition, then you plan for it very differently. An example for this is renewable energy. So we are having a very large technology transition in the way that we create energy for electricity and our day-to-day uses. And that doesn't happen overnight. It takes some time. It's a transition period. And so that needs to be looked at as a transition period and how people are transitioning towards that. Another transition period that we're in is we already went through a lot of the smart things, the Internet of Things. So many of our objects became connected to the Internet. But now we're going through the cognification of everything, where artificial intelligence is starting to make all of these smart things cognified, interactable with natural language processing, where you can communicate with AI and that object's data can be interacted with. In essence, though, if we think about what's happening in the transition aspect of the polycrisis, is that it's unlocking new value. And in the case of AI, as I mentioned in the last webinar, it's unlocking trillions in value. Just as we had the internet that came about, it created market shifts and waves, and it disrupted a lot of businesses, but it also created a lot of new value, and we have adjusted to it. But now we are also in a new state of this, where we have artificial intelligence that is again disrupting new value, disrupting old value, creating new value, and impacting the market. And so as we are transitioning, we need to think about the new value that's being created instead of worrying about only the disruption that's happening. All right, so if we take all the elements of the polycrisis and we put them into these buckets, we can also leverage AI to analyze faster what's happening. So you can prompt, what are the, and then for the elements that are a crisis, so for example, I mentioned climate change. You could say, what are the climate change areas affecting my organization, market, industry, supply chain, and or consumers? And so you're zeroing in on a particular crisis and asking exactly the ways that it's impacting the things you care about in your organization. And then what are the emerging new norms that will affect my business operations? So for example, when it comes to demographics, you can say, what are the emerging demographic trends that will affect my business operations? And then you could also expand, to say market, industry, supply chain, etc. And then with the transition bucket, you can say, what are the transition spaces of, and then you put something that's in transition, you can say renewable energy that my organization needs to manage to be on top of, or what are the AI trends that my organization needs to manage to be on top of it and stay competitive. So these are different ways to think about the many elements of the polycrisis. Now, I talked about mostly the elements that people are most aware of, but a lot of times people don't consider that technology also creates volatility, uncertainty, new technology, that is, when it's introduced into a market and it starts to create disruptive ways. And when that happens, there's also cognitive resistance to change. So it's not just that having several mindsets around different forms of the polycrisis is helpful, but it's also important to understand that there are different forms of human resistance to change that need to be managed as well. So in the book, I've identified several that I think are really important to keep in mind, and I will be talking about them through the perspective of technology. So the first one I think that many people are worried about is job insecurity, which is basically technological unemployment. They are concerned that new technology will take their job and they will lose their job. And as a result, they will not be able to pay their mortgage, their loans, they won't be able to support their family or pay for their pets. And not being able to have an income is a genuine concern. In fact, an example of this is Klarna. So the Klarna CEO around May this year came out with this tweet. It's since been deleted, but it's available on Reddit. And he was so excited and happy to share how he has leveraged generative AI and how much he's going to save this year. So he said he's going to save 10 million in marketing. And he's just completely mind blown, as he writes there, about how much AI can do. and that the image production that they would normally do has reduced from 6 weeks to 1 week. And I will let him.
Due to the implications of AI, since September, October, we have stopped recruitment. And in our case, with normal attrition rates that most tech companies have, where people stay about 5 years, this means that we are actually shrinking in number of employees by about 20% per year. So we hope that by the time we kind of get to that perspective, we're going to be able to present something that looks like revenue growth while costs actually diminishing at the same point of time.
And there was a lot of critique, and the reason he deleted that particular tweet is because of the many messages of hate of people who were saying that he's taking away people's jobs. And the thing is that there will be new jobs that will be created. However, I do think that there's also an element that organizations need to manage when they leverage technology to replace human tasks or jobs altogether. And in the case of Klarna, I do think that while I understand that it is quite impressive that he will be generating more revenue and costs will go down, this situation that he's created for himself is very positive for today. But the business model he has today won't necessarily be defensible or as relevant in 10 years. And so the need for organizations to continuously adapt is always going to be there. It's not going to go away. So it's important to not think of AI as solving our today's business model problems, but also leveraging human talent to continue to create new value moving forward. Another reason that people resist new technology is because they're just comfortable. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of people who like their phone. My dad held on to what he called his dinosaur phone. It was a Nokia. We all moved to smartphones, and he took a long time to switch over. And he just liked it. It worked, and there's nothing wrong with that. So there's some people who resist because they just don't want to change something that works really well. Another reason people resist is because they just genuinely do not want to learn anything new. And this was the case of somebody I had worked with. She didn't have Wi-Fi at her home, and she was a few years close to retirement. And in that organization, there was a lot of restructuring happening and modernization. And she, along with everyone else, was tasked to improve what they were doing and make it more relevant for today's market. And she resisted, just as she resisted having Wi-Fi at home. She also resisted at work and simply said that she just doesn't want to learn anything new and she doesn't want to do anything new, and that she was just hoping to count her days to retirement doing the exact same thing. And yeah, so this is a second reason of comfort why people resist change. And then there's mistrust. So there's mistrust in technology, but also lack of trust in the businesses that run these technologies and create these technologies. An example is social media. A lot of people mistrust how social media is managed, how the algorithms are managed, where their data goes, and they don't like using it. And a more recent example is the new type of vaccine, the mRNA vaccine that came out during COVID. Many people resisted using this new technology of vaccine because they did not trust it. Another cognitive resistance to change is inequality. So some people worry that a new technology will make them more marginalized. And the people who are most concerned about this are people who are minorities or have been marginalized in communities, and they feel vulnerable. So an example of this is somebody I know personally who was working with ChatGPT's 4.0 model, and he was working with an organization to develop a training model that was basically an AI, and the people would be able to use that AI to learn how to sell a car. So it was a car salesperson AI situation. And he created personas of all kinds of different customers. And the human who would then use this AI would be the salesperson working on their sales skills. The personas of the buyers that this person I know created were a tough buyer, somebody who doesn't know what they want, all kinds of different user profiles. But he did not include any gender. It was just a user persona, no gender involved. And so then when somebody would say who they were, the human user, and they would say their name, if their name was gendered, he noticed that the Chat GPT 4o model would give people with a female gendered name a harder time than people with a male gendered name. So basically, the end customer of this AI that he was developing was for somebody to come and just learn how to be a salesperson. And if that person was named, for example, John, then it doesn't matter who the user persona was, the sale went easier. But if, for example, and he gave me an example, he used the name Sarah. If the name Sarah was used as the salesperson, the user persona buyers, it doesn't matter which user persona it was, would give Sarah a really hard time, and she would have a hard time closing the deal. A person he worked with on this particular AI was somebody from Southeast Asia who had a Southeast Asian name. And he noticed that it wasn't just a female name, but it was also a Southeast Asian name that the AI would give a lot of trouble to. And so he found sexism and racism inherent in that GPT-4o model. And he tried to take it out, and he was unsuccessful. And so he was not able to deliver this particular AI to the client, citing that he has not been able to take out the racism and the sexism in it. So having resistance to technological change because of fear of inequality is another reason, as we've seen in that example. And then another one is fear of the unknown, because all these new technologies that are coming about, these are our firsts ever. And so we are literally living in this new, bold world. And what is to come isn't what has been. And so we have to grapple with all of these new things. We have to make sense of them. Our social structures are changing. Our values are changing along with it. And some people struggle with that. An example of this is some people who burnt cell phone towers that were 5G towers because they believed that they spread the virus, the coronavirus. This is just one example of fear of new things and what could come of them. And then there's also ethical concerns. So values and morality here are at play. And when I lived in Berlin, I knew several people who refused to use Amazon in Germany because they wanted to support small businesses, and they felt that Amazon was squishing small businesses from being seen and from making a profit as well. And so that is why they resist the Amazon marketplace. And then there are also religious reasons as to why people resist change. One example is IVF. Now it is a very common procedure for women to get pregnant. However, before it was highly contested as playing God, and there was a lot of religious concerns around it. Today, there are religious concerns about playing God in a new way. Now that we have DNA editing technology, people are thinking, well, let's DNA edit out cancer. And some people are saying, well, that's playing God. But we are still grappling with this new ethical situation. A more interesting one from a religious perspective and playing God is germline editing. So the gene editing I described before about doing a gene therapy to modify, for example, a cancerous gene, that would be what we see here on the left, the somatic gene editing. So it would edit a particular aspect, and that person would have that edited, but even if they had kids, it would never pass on to their children, that edit. However, if germline editing was done, then the gene would be edited inside the embryo. And in that case, when the child was born later in their life, that gene that was edited would also be passed on to their future children. And so this is now a religious question, whether some people can play God and do this. And then separately, there's also an ethical question about will we have superhumans? And some people cannot wait until that day is possible. This is an initiative that is trying to bring about an Olympics type game, but for enhanced people. So it doesn't matter how the person's been enhanced, whether it's gene editing or otherwise, the idea is to see what is possible. And it's called enhanced games. So another cognitive resistance to change, there are many, is the new social norms that it brings about. Because these new social norms can also result in a loss of status and also identity and community, because the value that somebody brought initially with their expertise or their place in society has changed as a result of technological change. And this creates a deep rupture, and we can see this, for example, in the coal mining industry with the change towards more renewable energy and the loss of status, identity, and community in that space. And so it takes time for us to adjust. The challenge we face today is that technology is accelerating so fast. We're seeing new innovations every day, every week, every year, and we don't have as much time as we used to have to adjust to these changes. Okay, so now let's get into the tools. The PESTEL framework is a lovely tool when you're looking at the polycrisis or very dynamically shifting topics such as acceleration of technology. And this was developed by a Harvard professor back in the 60s, and it was meant to analyze the macro trends and help, whether it was strategists or product managers or marketers, to discover opportunities and also manage threats at the same time. So it's an all-encompassing tool. And so what PESTEL stands for is for political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal. And of course, AI is a lovely tool to be able to use it and analyze it. So a simple way to do it is, say, do a PESTEL framework analysis on. And so some examples I have to fill in the blank here are the gene therapy industry, the growing global population above the age of 65 and what it means for the labor market. These are topics we've discussed in the previous slides. And then the impact artificial intelligence automation will have on the car manufacturing industry. So let's take the population over 65 as an example and put that through, I used Perplexity. And so here are the answers. And we have, because we said do a PESTEL analysis, it has done that. And so it has provided the political aspects. So talking about social security provisions, and then economic, thinking about labor shortages, something we've talked about before. And also socially thinking about caregiving and healthcare, and also technology, thinking about how accessibility technology can be useful. And then we have the environmental and the legal. And so this is a way to quickly do the PESTEL framework and get a high-level idea of the key macro trends to think about for any given element of the polycrisis. Another tool I think is lovely is to think about the different types of risks. So a friend of mine, Dr. John Mark Rickley, based in Switzerland, developed this for geopolitical officers, chief geopolitical officers, and it's a guide, and he includes 6 types of risk. And we talked about this because I thought these 6 risks were great, but I felt he was missing, and I will pause there and get back to that. First, I'll explain each risk. So the types of risks that he thinks that geopolitical minded strategists and organizations need to look at are operational, so thinking about business continuity and processes; reputational, how the good standing of a brand may change negatively; financially, what the the classics, the market risk, credit risk, and liquidity risk. From a security perspective, employee safety to infrastructure to cybersecurity. Market access, geopolitical changes can change market access. So taking a look at that, supply chain and regulations. And I haven't really seen anyone talk about existential risk in this way. And I do appreciate that he's included it because there's so many changes that could actually be existential for an organization. Just today, I saw that a company that was helping students, it was designed to help students with their homework. They have officially had to lay off a lot of people because ChatGPT has become the alternative. And so understanding different changes can help an organization anticipate when it's going to impact them in a way that could be existential. So back to the other items, I said to him, you have not included climate. Climate is so important because climate adversity can affect supply chain, it can affect natural resources, it can affect labor. So if part of the supply chain is in a country that experiences more and more serious climatic events, then that will be a weak point in the supply chain and affect the delivery. And when we had this conversation, he said, you know, yes, I should have added that, but if I could go back, I would really love to add human risk. And by human risk, he means the sociocultural changes that are happening as a result of technology and that change the value proposition and the value perception of a company. And I do think that the cognitive resistance to change, the items that we had just talked about, I think that these fall squarely inside this human risk, where something is created, but then there's so many forms of resistance to it, and those things need to be managed as well. And I agree with him that I don't think enough people consider that. An example he gave when we talked about it was his grandparents. And he said that in their lifetime, the amount of technology change that they've had to experience wasn't happening at the intervals that it's happening right now. And that it is very overwhelming to have to change so much and learn so many new things all the time. And so that he places all of that inside this kind of question of how will culture change and how will society adapt? And that is something that businesses really need to be thinking about as well. So something that I think that you can do is you can characterize these risks that are relevant, whether it's to your organization, your client, your customer, your industry, your market, or your supply chain, but take a look at these. And of course, I have prompts. So I want to show two prompts, one in a generalized format and another one in a specific one. So let's look at a generalized example here. And if we think about the 8 risks, of course, you could put all 8 risks inside the prompt, but here I just wanted to put one. So what are the key market access risks in the European Union to software as a service companies? And then a specific prompt, it could be, I am a produce farmer in Spain. Tell me what kinds of security risks I need to consider in my plan to implement smart farming technology. So it's added another layer so that it's smart farming, that technology to add to this particular value proposition. And we have a geographical location as well. And we're looking specifically at the security risks. So just to kind of show you a little bit of the output. So if we look at the European Union example, so we've got the data protection, the new Digital Services Act, the cybersecurity regulations, market fragmentation and competition with European providers, because there's more and more an interest of data sovereignty and looking towards continental-based companies. So just as a glance, you already get so much information that you can work with. And then with the smart farming one in Spain, here's again the result. Again, I use Perplexity. So it's security considerations for smart farming technologies. So cybersecurity threats up at the top, and because it's such a big one, the AI puts some sub components like data breaches, equipment tampering, and ransomware. And it's crazy to think that farmers today have to think about ransomware, but all industries are becoming digital. And then infrastructure vulnerabilities, because now that you're using the cloud, you need to think about network reliability and then data management risks and legal compliance. And so here you have the security considerations, and you can also get mitigation strategies. I'm not saying that AI or any type of generative AI should be your be all and end all, but I'm just showing how they can be leveraged to accelerate the analysis of anything related to the polycrisis, managing a crisis, understanding risk, managing risk, thinking about managing risk. So the fact of the matter is that the polycrisis is not going to get less complicated. It's going to get more complicated. And that is because we have many things converging at once. They're happening fast. They're dynamically changing. A lot of them are uncertain and they're volatile. And so we need to be more in tune to how to see the many elements that are in our international arena right now. So I go back to this slide because this is the way that I personally make sense of it. I mean, you can add more or take out from here, but for me, I find this very helpful to think about the intersections that are happening, whether it is to manage risk or to even identify opportunity. Because in risk, there's also a lot of opportunity. And again, this is in the last page of the book. And so that is where I will pause here. The song that I used Suno AI to create for this chapter was based on a short prompt about the theme of this chapter. And the AI titled this song Polycrisis Everywhere. And I thought the lyrics were quite insightful about this situation. Again, it was just like a one-sentence prompt. So I encourage you to check it out. I think the lyrics are really interesting. Again, I didn't make them. It was AI generated, the song and the lyrics. And if you would like to work together or for me to speak at an event or think that there's areas of synergies, do reach out. And our Imagination Wednesday for next week is for chapter 4. We're going to start the 4 facets of imagination, starting with identity. And we have some case studies and tools. So it'll be next Wednesday, and I look forward to seeing you then.